When we think of the Vikings, we often visualize images of fierce warriors swinging their swords in battle, but what about the women who stood beside them? In the Middle Ages, being a woman was no walk in the park, especially during the Viking era. You might think with all the raiding and invading going on, Viking women didn't have much of a say in things. However, when it came to gender equality, the Norse society was one of the fairest in Europe. Join us today as we journey back to the Viking Age and delve into the everyday life of Viking women. But before we do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. To fully understand the world of Viking women, we must first transport ourselves to the Viking Age, a period that spanned roughly from the 8th to the 11th centuries. Technically, women weren't even called Vikings back in the day. The term Vikinger in Old Norse referred specifically to men, particularly those brave warriors who set sail from Scandinavia in those famous long boats. Between 793 and 1066, they roamed far and wide, from Britain and Europe to Russia, the North Atlantic islands, and even North America. These Vikings were also skilled traders who established trade routes all over the world. They set up communities, founded towns and cities, and left their mark on the local languages and cultures wherever they landed their ships. Previous historical research on the Vikings found that the Norsemen usually left on voyages in all-male groups. This could have been because of a scarcity of eligible female partners within Scandinavia. However, a more recent study offers a very different perspective. Scientists used mitochondrial DNA to find that Viking women actually traveled alongside the males during the Viking Age migrations. They traveled all the way to England, the Shetland and Orkney Islands, and Iceland. This showed the crucial role played by Norse women during the process of migration. In lowly populated areas like Iceland, Norse women were particularly important in populating the newly settled regions. This was how the Vikings would assimilate the local cultures and leave their own footing in those regions. This left many wondering, were there any female warriors in Viking Age society? While historical records mentioning women in Viking warfare are hard to find, there are some interesting discoveries. Historian Johannes Skylitzes found records of women in battle alongside the Varangian Vikings from 971 AD. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus also discovered the communities of shield maidens who dressed and fought like men. They were experts with swordplay and lethal with their martial skills. According to Saxo, around 300 of these shield maidens took part in the Battle of Bravilla in the mid-8th century. He also found evidence of one remarkable shield maiden named Lagertha. She fought alongside the famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok in a battle against the Swedes. Her courage left such an impression on Ragnar that he became obsessed with her and won her hand in marriage. So, given the power and status they had during that time, it's likely that Viking women took up arms and fought, especially when the safety of their families was at stake. But while the parties were away on their trading trips, it was up to women to manage the land. Their sons took care of the fields in their father's absence, while women were in charge of looking after the animals. Their day started with milking the cows and taking the produce over to the dairy next door to kickstart the day's work. Now, dairy stuff was a big deal in the Viking diet, and it was mostly the women who handled making the cheese, butter, and other dairy products. They used churns to whip up butter, and they'd show their daughters how to heat milk in a pan to start the 5-week cheese-making process. Passing along these skills was crucial because their daughters might have their own farms to run one day, especially considering they could get married at a young age. Managing the land meant keeping an eye out for every opportunity possible. Honey was a rare commodity used primarily for mead, and it was the job of women to collect it and keep it stored safely for trading. In the event the farmland wasn't producing enough crops, the women wouldn't just sit about and wait. They would actively make the decision to uproot their families and bravely venture out into the seas to leave Scandinavia in search of better land. Once settled into a new home, the women would take charge of the homely duties. Viking longhouses were simple, usually just one big room where everything happened, from cooking and sleeping to socializing. Since they lived in large family groups, with grandmothers, children, and parents all living together, the women of the house would come together to help with dinner preparations. Afterward, they would socialize by spending the next few hours together, busy spinning wool from their sheep into yarn. They took the cleaned and dried wool from the day before and used a spindle stick to turn it into yarn. Later, they could weave this yarn into woolen fabric on a loom or knit it into small items like socks. Textile work was a big part of a Viking woman's job, and it could be quite demanding. They not only worked with wool but also had to make linen. To create the cloth, they planted flax seeds, grew the plants, harvested them, soaked the stems in water, and then separated the fibers. Finally, they would spin them into linen thread, which was used to weave linen fabric or for sewing and other needs. Women were also crafting tapestries that adorned wealthy homes and important buildings. There are very few textiles that have survived from that era. But the remnants of the Osberg tapestry recovered from a double female ship burial in Norway around 830 AD show intricate and refined workmanship. Besides weaving beautiful tapestries, women were also in charge of crafting the sails for Viking ships using woven wool strips and stitching them together. While they could buy or trade for more complex items like shoes or tools from village artisans, most of what the society needed in their daily lives was made right at home. It was a lot of work, but having their daughters and mother-in-law around helped make it much easier. As the evening set in, women would spend time involved with their community. Their children's friends would stop by and would head into the woods to pick fruits and berries. The women would sit by the fire, finish up some light sewing, and enjoy their time together with friends. Viking women also had more say in their marriages than in many other European regions. They could ask for a divorce by simply calling in a witness to their home and declaring their wish to separate. The marriage contract usually spelled out how their property would be divided in such cases, and some women could even get their dowries back. They could even own property under their own names, which was an unusual degree of freedom considering the age they lived in. Although men were considered the heads of their households, women also held responsibility for managing both their husbands and the household. In the domestic sphere, Norse women had full authority, particularly when their husbands were away. In the unfortunate event of a man's passing, his wife would assume his role permanently. She would take charge of the family farm and trading enterprise all by herself. Research found that many Viking Age women were buried with rings of keys, symbolizing their roles and authority as household managers. The women of the household also played important roles as the moral and spiritual guides for the family. In the Viking Age, when you think of storytellers, it's usually the men, like the skalds. But Viking women were also great storytellers, keeping the oral tradition alive right in their homes. They shared tales of myths and sagas with their kids about the many Norse gods, Viking heroes, and supernatural beings. Passing down these stories and beliefs to the younger generation was a mother's important duty. In the midst of Viking warriors and epic sagas, the stories of Viking women stand as a testament to their strength, resourcefulness, and resilience. Their contributions to society, though often hidden, were invaluable. It's a reminder that history is full of unsung heroes, and by uncovering these stories, we gain a deeper understanding of the past.